The conference room at Morrison Associates fell silent as Laura Chen-Martinez stared at her phone screen, her hands trembling slightly as she read the text message that would change everything. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the downtown Seattle office, the Space Needle gleamed in the afternoon sun, but Laura barely noticed. The words on her screen seemed to blur together. Don't bring that baby to Mom's birthday party. Some children just don't belong at family events. 26 years old, sitting in her dream job as a junior marketing coordinator, Laura had thought she finally had it all figured out. But as she looked down at the sleeping face of her 3-month-old son Mason and his carrier beside her desk, she realized that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally can deliver the most devastating blows. This is the story of how one cruel message sparked a journey that would transform not just Laura's life, but challenge everything she thought she knew about family, belonging, and the incredible strength that can emerge from the deepest wounds. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Laura had always been the peacekeeper in the Martinez family. Growing up in the suburbs of Bellevue, Washington, she was the youngest of 3 siblings, always trying to smooth over the tensions that seemed to simmer just beneath the surface of their weekly family dinners. Her older brother David was the golden child, a successful real estate developer with a beautiful wife, a sprawling house in Mercer Island, and the kind of confidence that seemed to come naturally to him. Her sister Carmen was the rebel, the one who'd moved to Portland after college and only showed up for major holidays, usually with a different boyfriend and a new tattoo. Laura fell somewhere in between, responsible enough to earn her parents' approval, but not quite successful enough to command their full attention. She'd graduated from University of Washington with decent grades, found a stable job, and was working her way up the corporate ladder with quiet determination. She lived in a modest 1-bedroom apartment in Capitol Hill, drove a reliable Honda Civic, and had been dating her college boyfriend Jake Thompson on and off for 4 years. The Martinez family had their traditions. Sunday dinners at her parents' house in Bellevue were sacred. Maria Martinez would spend all day preparing elaborate meals, and Roberto Martinez would hold court at the head of the dinner table, sharing stories from his days as a construction foreman and offering unsolicited advice about everyone's life choices. David and his wife Stephanie would arrive fashionably late in their Tesla, regaling everyone with stories about their latest vacation or home renovation project. Carmen would video call in from Portland when she remembered, usually interrupting dinner with some crisis that needed immediate attention. Laura was the constant. She never missed a Sunday dinner, she remembered everyone's birthdays, organized the family gift exchanges, and was always the first to volunteer when someone needed help. When her father had his minor heart attack 2 years ago, Laura had been the one to coordinate his care and make sure her mother wasn't overwhelmed. When David and Stephanie had marital problems last year, Laura had listened to Stephanie's complaints for hours, offering tissues and reassurance. But everything changed when Laura discovered she was pregnant. She and Jake had been in one of their off periods when it happened. They'd had another one of their circular arguments about commitment and the future, and Jake had stormed out of her apartment declaring he needed space to figure things out. Laura had thrown herself into work, picking up extra projects and staying late at the office. She attributed her exhaustion and nausea to stress and too much takeout food. When she finally took the pregnancy test on a rainy Thursday evening in March, staring at the 2 pink lines in her tiny bathroom, Laura felt her world shift on its axis. She was 25, single, living paycheck to paycheck, and utterly unprepared for motherhood. But as she sat on the edge of her bathtub, something unexpected happened. A fierce protectiveness washed over her, stronger than any fear. She called Jake first. His response was predictable. Panic, followed by suggestions about options, followed by a hasty retreat when Laura made it clear she was keeping the baby. They met for coffee once more, a stilted conversation where Jake signed away any claim to parental rights and promised to send money when he could, which they both knew meant never. Telling her family was harder. Laura had rehearsed the conversation a dozen times, but nothing had prepared her for the actual moment. She'd chosen a Sunday dinner in late April, waiting until after dessert when everyone was relaxed and content. "I have some news," she had said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm pregnant." The silence that followed felt eternal. Her mother's face cycled through shock, disappointment, and finally, resignation. Her father's jaw tightened, and she could see him calculating the implications. What would the neighbors think? What would his coworkers say? David looked uncomfortable, glancing at Stephanie with an expression Laura couldn't quite read. Carmen, joining virtually from her Portland apartment, was the first to speak. "Oh, honey," Carmen had said, her pixelated face full of sympathy. "Are you okay? Do you need anything?" The conversation that followed was careful and polite. Her parents asked the necessary questions. Was she keeping the baby? What were her plans? Did she need financial help? David offered practical advice about health insurance and prenatal care. Stephanie smiled tightly and made appropriate noises about how exciting it all was. But Laura could feel the shift. There was a distance now, a subtle change in how they looked at her. She was no longer the reliable daughter who had her life together. She was now the daughter who'd made a mistake, who would need help, who would complicate family gatherings and holiday photos. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, despite Laura's anxieties about doing it alone. She threw herself into preparation, reading every book, attending every class, transforming her small apartment into a space that could accommodate a baby. Her coworkers at Morrison Associates were supportive, and her boss, Jennifer Walsh, assured her that her job would be waiting when she returned from maternity leave. Mason Roberto Martinez was born on a clear December morning, 3 days before Christmas. She had labored for 16 hours at Swedish Medical Center, with Carmen flying in from Portland to be her birthing partner. As she held her son for the first time, Laura felt a love so overwhelming it took her breath away. Mason had her dark hair and her mother's nose, but his eyes were entirely his own, bright and alert, seemingly taking in the world with curiosity rather than fear. The first few months were a blur of feedings, diaper changes, and sleepless nights. She had taken 12 weeks of maternity leave, and she treasured every moment, even the difficult ones. She found herself talking to Mason constantly, narrating their days together, sharing her hopes and dreams for his future. He was an easy baby, content and alert, and Laura began to feel like maybe she could do this after all. Returning to work in March was harder than she had anticipated. She'd found an excellent daycare center near her office, and Mason seemed to thrive there, but Laura struggled with the separation. She pumped milk in the small conference room her company had designated for nursing mothers, counting the hours until she could pick up her son and hold him again. It was during one of these pumping sessions, 3 weeks after returning to work, that Laura received the text message that would shatter her carefully constructed world. She'd been scrolling through her phone, looking at the photos Carmen had sent from Mason's latest visit to Portland, when David's message popped up. The words seemed to burn themselves into her retinas. "Don't bring that baby to Mom's birthday party. Some children just don't belong at family events." Laura stared at the message, reading it over and over, certain she must be misunderstanding something. Her mother's 70th birthday party was this coming Saturday, a celebration that had been planned for months. Laura had already bought a gift, arranged for time off work, and purchased a special outfit for Mason. She'd been looking forward to showing off how much he'd grown, to seeing her family coo over his new tricks and milestones. But now, as she sat in the sterile conference room with the sound of the breast pump providing a mechanical rhythm to her shock, Laura realized that something fundamental had shifted in her family's perception of her and her son. The careful politeness of the past year had been masking something much more painful, a rejection so complete it took her breath away. As she finished pumping and prepared to return to her desk, Laura looked at her phone one more time. No follow-up message from David, no explanation or clarification, just those brutal words hanging in the digital space between them. Some children just don't belong at family events. Laura gathered her things slowly, her hands still shaking slightly. She had 3 days until the party, 3 days to figure out how to respond to this unexpected cruelty from the brother she'd always looked up to. As she walked back to her desk, where Mason's baby photos smiled at her from their small frames, Laura felt something hardening inside her chest. Not bitterness exactly, but a recognition that the family she'd worked so hard to keep together might not be worth the effort she had been putting in. She had no idea that this moment of rejection would become the catalyst for a transformation that would surprise everyone who knew her, most of all herself.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Laura spent the rest of that afternoon in a fog. She attended her team meeting, nodding at appropriate intervals while Jennifer Walsh discussed the upcoming campaign for their biggest client, but her mind kept circling back to David's message. She found herself checking her phone obsessively, hoping for some kind of follow-up explanation, an apology, even an acknowledgement that he'd sent something so cruel. Nothing came. At 5:30 p.m., she picked up Mason from Little Sprouts Daycare, forcing herself to smile and chat normally with Mrs. Chen, the center director. Mason babbled happily in his car seat during the drive home, completely oblivious to the storm clouds gathering around their small family unit. As Laura carried him up the stairs to their Capitol Hill apartment, she made a decision. She would call David directly and demand an explanation. But David didn't answer. The call went straight to voicemail, his professionally recorded message asking her to leave her name and number. Laura hung up without saying anything, her hands shaking with a mixture of anger and hurt that surprised her with its intensity. That evening, as she fed Mason his bottle and watched him gaze up at her with those bright, trusting eyes, Laura found herself talking to him in a way she never had before. "Your Uncle David thinks you don't belong at family parties," she whispered, stroking his soft cheek. "But he's wrong, isn't he, baby boy? You belong everywhere I belong. We're a team now." Mason gurgled in response, his tiny hand wrapping around her finger with surprising strength. In that moment, Laura felt something crystallize inside her, a protective fierceness that went beyond anything she'd experienced before. It wasn't just hurt feelings anymore. It was a recognition that she would need to fight for her son's place in the world, starting with their own family. The next morning brought a text from her mother. "Mija, I heard about David's message. Come to lunch today. We need to talk." Laura stared at the message over her morning coffee, Mason contentedly playing in his bouncy seat nearby. So her mother knew, which meant David had discussed his decision to exclude Mason with at least one other family member. Laura felt a fresh wave of betrayal wash over her. She called in sick to work, only the second time she had done so since returning from maternity leave, and drove to her parents' house in Bellevue with a sense of dread settling in her stomach. Maria Martinez answered the door before Laura could knock, pulling her daughter into a tight embrace that smelled of the vanilla perfume she'd worn for as long as Laura could remember. But even her mother's familiar comfort felt different now, tinged with an awkwardness that hadn't been there before. "Where's the baby?" Maria asked, looking past Laura to the empty car seat in her hands. "At daycare, I thought this conversation might be better without him here." They sat in the kitchen where Laura had grown up, at the same oak table where she'd done homework and shared countless family meals. Maria poured coffee from the pot she always kept brewing and cut thick slices of the tres leches cake she made every week. "David is concerned," Maria began carefully, not meeting Laura's eyes. "He thinks Mason's presence at family events might be, disruptive." "Disruptive how?" Laura asked, although she could already feel her heart sinking as she recognized the diplomatic tone her mother used when she was trying to smooth over family conflicts. "Well, you know how Stephanie has been struggling with, fertility issues, and seeing Mason, especially at celebratory occasions, might be difficult for her. David thinks it would be more considerate if we stayed home," Laura finished, setting down her coffee cup with more force than necessary. "If my son and I just disappeared whenever it might be inconvenient for David and Stephanie." Maria's face crumpled slightly. "It's not about you, Mija. You know how much we love you. but sometimes we have to make sacrifices for family harmony. The word sacrifices hit Laura like a physical blow. She'd been making sacrifices for family harmony her entire life, staying close to home for college so she could help with her father's recovery, giving up weekend plans to help David move into his new house, spending her vacation days caring for her grandmother before she passed away. When had she become the one whose needs were always considered expendable? "What about my family harmony?" Laura asked quietly. "What about Mason's right to know his grandparents, his uncle, his aunt? What about the fact that I've been the one holding this family together for years, and now you're asking me to disappear because my son's existence makes someone else uncomfortable?" Maria reached across the table, but Laura pulled her hands back. "It's just temporary," her mother said. "Maybe after Stephanie gets pregnant." "Maybe never," Laura interrupted. "Maybe Stephanie never gets pregnant, and maybe David decides that Mason will always be a reminder of what they can't have. Maybe I should just accept that my son will never be welcome at Christmas mornings or birthday parties or family barbecues. Maybe I should raise him to understand that he's less important than other people's comfort."
The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the clock Laura had heard every day of her childhood. Maria's eyes filled with tears, but Laura felt strangely dry-eyed, as if the hurt had gone so deep it had passed beyond crying. "I need to go," Laura said, standing up and gathering her purse. "I have to think about this." "Laura, please don't make this bigger than it has to be," Maria called after her. "We're still family." But as Laura drove back toward Seattle, she wondered what that word even meant anymore. Family was supposed to be the people who loved you unconditionally, who celebrated your joys and supported you through challenges. Family was supposed to welcome new members with open arms, especially helpless babies who had done nothing wrong except exist. That afternoon, Laura did something she'd never done before. She called in a personal day for the following day and drove to Portland to see Carmen. The 3-hour drive through the Columbia River Gorge gave her time to think, with Mason sleeping peacefully in his car seat behind her. She'd always been the responsible one, the one who followed rules and avoided confrontation. But watching the dramatic landscape pass by her windows, Laura felt something shifting inside her. Maybe it was time to stop being so accommodating. Maybe it was time to demand better treatment instead of just hoping for it. Carmen lived in a converted loft in Portland's Pearl District, a space filled with her artwork and the eclectic furniture she'd collected from thrift stores and flea markets. She opened the door wearing paint-splattered overalls and immediately pulled Laura into a fierce hug. "I've been waiting for you to finally get angry," Carmen said without preamble. "You want some wine? Oh, wait, are you still nursing?" "I am, but I could use something stronger than coffee," Laura admitted, settling Mason in the portable playpen Carmen had borrowed from a neighbor. They sat on Carmen's couch, a vintage velvet piece she'd rescued from an estate sale, and Laura told her sister everything. Not just about David's message, but about the months of subtle exclusion, the careful politeness that masked disappointment, the way conversations stopped when she entered rooms with Mason. "You know what this is really about?" Carmen said when Laura finished. "It's about control. David's always been the golden child, and now suddenly you've done something that puts you at the center of attention. Even negative attention is still attention, and he can't stand it." "But Stephanie's fertility issues are real and heartbreaking, I'm sure, but they're not your fault and they're not Mason's fault. And if David really cared about his wife's feelings, he'd get her into therapy instead of asking you to hide your baby." Laura looked over at Mason, who was staring in fascination at a mobile Carmen had hung above the playpen, abstract shapes and bright colors that danced in the afternoon light streaming through the loft's huge windows. "I don't want him to grow up feeling unwanted. I don't want him to think there's something wrong with him because he doesn't have a traditional family." "Then don't let them make him feel that way," Carmen replied. "You have more power here than you think. You've been playing by their rules your whole life, but nobody elected them to make the rules. You can make your own." That night, sleeping in Carmen's guest room with Mason in a portable crib beside her, Laura made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to beg for acceptance anymore. She wasn't going to shrink herself or hide her son to make other people comfortable. and she certainly wasn't going to miss her mother's 70th birthday party. The next morning, she drove back to Seattle with a plan forming in her mind. She would attend the party, and she would bring Mason. Not to cause drama or prove a point, but because they belonged there. Because she was done letting other people decide her worth. But first, she had a phone call to make. As soon as she got home, Laura dialed David's number again. This time, he answered. "Laura," he said, his voice careful and distant. "I was wondering when you'd call." "We need to talk," Laura said, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "Not about whether Mason and I are coming to Mom's party. We are. But about what happens after that. Because things are going to change, David. I'm done being the family doormat." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Laura, you're being dramatic." "No," she interrupted. "I'm being a mother, and it's about time." After she hung up, Laura looked around her small apartment, at the baby toys scattered on the living room floor, at the photos of Mason that covered every surface, at the life she'd built for the two of them despite everyone's doubts. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was theirs, and she was finally ready to fight for it. The real battle was just beginning.
Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical Pacific Northwest weather that seemed to match Laura's nervous energy. She stood in front of her bedroom mirror, holding up different outfits while Mason played on a blanket at her feet, completely oblivious to the significance of the day ahead. Laura had barely slept the night before, running through various scenarios of how the birthday party might unfold. Would David confront her directly? Would Stephanie make a scene? Would her parents ask her to leave? The uncertainty was eating at her, but beneath the anxiety was something new, a steely determination that surprised her with its strength. She finally settled on a simple navy dress that she could easily nurse in if needed, paired with the pearl earrings her grandmother had left her. As she fastened them, Laura caught her reflection in the mirror and realized she looked different somehow. There was something in her eyes that hadn't been there a week ago, a resolve that went beyond her usual people-pleasing tendencies. "What do you think, baby boy?" she asked Mason, who responded by blowing a spit bubble and kicking his legs enthusiastically. "Ready to meet your extended family, whether they want to meet you or not?" The drive to her parents' house felt both endless and too short. Laura had prepared everything meticulously. Mason's diaper bag was stocked with enough supplies for a small army. She'd fed him right before leaving to minimize the chance of him being fussy, and she'd even practiced responses to potential confrontational comments in her head. But nothing could have prepared her for the scene that greeted her when she pulled into the circular driveway of her childhood home. David's Tesla was there, along with cars she didn't recognize. Clearly, other family, friends, and relatives had been invited. Through the large front windows, Laura could see people milling around with champagne glasses, laughing and chatting. The party was in full swing, and for a moment, her resolve wavered. Maybe she should just leave. Maybe this wasn't worth the potential drama. Then Mason made a small cooing sound from his car seat, and Laura's backbone straightened. This was his family, too. His grandmother's 70th birthday was his first major family celebration, and she refused to let David's prejudices steal that from him. Laura gathered her courage, lifted Mason from his car seat, and walked toward the front door. She could feel eyes on her through the windows, conversations pausing as people noticed her arrival. By the time she reached the door, it was already opening. "Laura!" Her mother appeared, dressed in the elegant burgundy dress Laura had helped her pick out for the occasion. Maria's smile was bright but strained, and Laura could see the worry lines around her eyes. "You came." "Of course I came," Laura replied, adjusting Mason in her arms. "It's your birthday party, Mom." Maria's gaze dropped to Mason, and for a moment her expression softened completely. "Oh, he's gotten so big," she whispered, reaching out tentatively to touch his cheek. "Look at those eyes." "He wants to meet his grandmother properly," Laura said, gently placing Mason in Maria's arms before anyone could object. The transformation was immediate. Maria's face lit up as Mason studied her with curious eyes,
then broke into one of his heart-melting smiles. "Oh, mi nieto, you're perfect." "Mom," David's voice came from behind them, sharp with warning. "What's going on?" "I'm introducing your nephew to his grandmother." "Happy birthday, David." "Stephanie." The silence stretched uncomfortably as other party guests began to notice the tension. Laura recognized her father's business partner, her mother's book club friends, her Aunt Rosa and Uncle Miguel from Tacoma. All conversations had stopped, and Laura could feel the weight of their curious stares. "Laura," David said, his voice low but carrying clearly in the sudden quiet, "I thought we discussed this. Actually, you sent me a text message and then refused to discuss anything. But Mason and I are here to celebrate Mom's birthday, same as everyone else." Stephanie stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Laura had always liked Stephanie. She was usually warm and funny, quick with compliments, and always remembering small details about people's lives. But today she looked brittle, as if she might shatter at any moment. It's difficult," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Seeing him, it reminds me of what I can't—" "Stephanie," David interrupted, placing a protective hand on his wife's shoulder, "you don't need to explain anything." But something in Stephanie's expression stopped Laura cold. This wasn't just about fertility struggles or family politics. There was genuine pain in the other woman's eyes, a grief so raw it was almost physical. "Stephanie," Laura said gently, still holding her ground but softening her tone, "I'm sorry about what you're going through. I know how much you and David want children. But Mason isn't here to hurt you. He's here because this is his family." "Is it?" David's voice had turned cold. "Because from where I stand, it looks like you made some pretty poor choices and now expect everyone else to deal with the consequences." The comment about Jake was designed to wound, and it succeeded. Laura felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, an unexpected voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." Roberto Martinez stepped into the circle, his weathered face dark with anger. Laura's father was not a tall man, but he had the kind of presence that came from decades of managing construction crews and dealing with difficult people. "David, you will apologize to your sister. Now."
"Dad," David began. "Now," Roberta repeated, his voice carrying the authority that had never failed to get results when they were children. But David was no longer a child, and his success had given him his own kind of authority. "I won't apologize for protecting my wife," he said, meeting his father's stare, "or for pointing out that actions have consequences." "The only consequence I see," came another voice from the crowd, "is that this family has a beautiful new member." Laura turned to see her Aunt Rosa pushing through the gathered guests, her round face bright with determination. Rosa had always been Laura's favorite aunt, loud, warm, and completely fearless when it came to speaking her mind. "Give me that baby," Rosa demanded, holding out her arms to Maria. "I want to meet my grandnephew properly." Maria hesitated, glancing between her sons and her daughter, clearly torn between keeping the peace and following her heart. "Maria," Rosa said more gently, "it's your birthday. Hold your grandson." The simple statement seemed to break through whatever paralysis had gripped Laura's mother. Maria tightened her arms around Mason protectively and lifted her chin with a dignity Laura had never seen before. "You're right," Maria said, her voice stronger than it had been all morning. "It is my birthday, and I want to celebrate with all of my family. That includes my grandson." David's face flushed with anger. "Fine, but don't expect Stephanie and me to participate in this, whatever this is." "What this is," said Uncle Miguel, stepping up beside his wife, "is a family celebration. And if you can't handle that, maybe you should leave." Laura watched in amazement as the battle lines were drawn. It hadn't occurred to her that other family members might take sides, might see the situation differently than David did. But now she could see the divisions clearly. Rosa and Miguel stood with her parents, while David and Stephanie formed their own isolated unit.
Other relatives and family friends were choosing sides with their body language, some moving closer to Laura and Mason, others gravitating toward David. "This is ridiculous," said Stephanie, her voice tight with tears. "We're leaving." As David and Stephanie gathered their things and made their exit, Laura felt a confusing mixture of victory and loss. She'd won the right to be at the party, but at what cost? The family gathering was now fractured, the celebration atmosphere destroyed. But then Mason let out a delighted squeal, reaching up to grab at Maria's necklace with chubby fingers, and Laura's grandmother Rosa burst into laughter. "Look at him," Rosa said, moving closer to coo at the baby. "He's flirting with all the ladies already, just like his Uncle Miguel used to do." "Hey," Miguel protested with mock indignation, "I still flirt with the ladies. Your Aunt Rosa just makes sure they don't flirt back." The tension began to ease as other relatives crowded around to meet Mason properly. Laura found herself answering questions about his sleeping schedule, his favorite toys, whether he looked more like her or his father. Normal questions, the kind she'd imagined having at family gatherings, but had been denied until now. As the afternoon wore on, Laura began to relax. Mason was being passed from relative to relative, charming everyone with his easy smiles and curious expressions. Her mother seemed transformed, glowing with pride as she introduced her grandson to friends and neighbors. But Laura also noticed the empty spaces where David and Stephanie should have been. The family photos were incomplete, conversations felt stilted when anyone mentioned the dramatic departure, and Laura could see the sadness in her parents' eyes even as they celebrated. This was a victory, but it was complicated victory. Laura had claimed her place at the family table, but she'd also learned that holding on to that place might require more strength than she'd ever imagined. As she drove home that evening, Mason sleeping peacefully in his car seat, Laura reflected on the day's lessons. She'd discovered she had allies she didn't know about, but she had also learned that standing up for herself came with costs. David's hostility was now in the open, undeniable, and ugly. But she'd also seen her mother hold her grandson with tears of joy in her eyes. She'd watched Rosa and Miguel welcome Mason with open arms. She'd experienced what it felt like to have her family divided, but also what it felt like to have people fight for her. The real challenges were just beginning, but for the first time since this all started, Laura felt like she might be strong enough to face them. The week following her mother's birthday party brought an unexpected flood of support that left Laura feeling both grateful and overwhelmed. Her phone buzzed constantly with texts from relatives she hadn't heard from in months, all wanting to share their thoughts about the confrontation with David and to arrange visits with Mason. Aunt Rosa called 3 times in 2 days, each conversation lasting over an hour as she regaled Laura with stories about family conflicts from decades past and offered unsolicited advice about handling difficult men. Uncle Miguel stopped by her apartment Wednesday evening with a homemade high chair he'd crafted in his woodworking shop, claiming Mason needed proper furniture for a proper Martinez man. But it was her father's visit that surprised Laura the most. Roberto Martinez had never been the type to drop by unannounced. He was a man of routine and tradition, someone who believed in formal family dinners and scheduled phone calls. So when Laura opened her door Thursday evening to find him standing in the hallway of her Capitol Hill apartment building, holding a bag from her favorite Thai restaurant, she was momentarily speechless. "I brought dinner," he said gruffly, stepping past her into the small living space. "Figured you might be tired after work." They ate pad thai and green curry, while Mason lay on his playmat, batting at the colorful toys hanging above him. Roberto watched his grandson with an intensity Laura had never seen before, occasionally reaching down to let Mason grip his weathered finger. "Your brother called me," Roberto said finally, not looking up from the baby. "He thinks I owe him an apology for taking your side at the party." Laura's chopsticks paused halfway to her mouth. "What did you tell him?" "I told him he owes everyone an apology, starting with you and ending with his mother whose birthday he ruined with his selfishness. David's always been prideful, but this is something else.
"This is cruelty." It was the longest speech Laura had ever heard her father make about family dynamics, and she found herself blinking back unexpected tears. Roberto had never been demonstrative with his emotions, but his presence here, his willingness to openly choose her side, meant more than any grand gesture could have. "I'm sorry it had to come to this," Laura said quietly. "I know you hate family conflict." Roberto looked up then, meeting her eyes with a directness that reminded her why construction crews had always respected him. "Some conflicts are worth having. When someone tries to make you ashamed of your child, that's worth fighting for." That weekend, Laura made a decision that would have been unthinkable just a month earlier. Instead of her usual routine of grocery shopping and cleaning while Mason napped, she drove to Mercer Island. David and Stephanie's house was a showcase of their success, a sprawling modern construction with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Washington. Laura had helped them move in 2 years ago, had spent countless evenings on their deck, drinking wine and listening to their plans for renovations and future children. Now, sitting in her Honda Civic in their circular driveway, with Mason sleeping in his car seat, she felt like she was approaching enemy territory. Stephanie answered the door, her face cycling through surprise, discomfort, and something that might have been relief. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes and the kind of pale complexion that came from too little sleep and too much stress. "Laura," she said, glancing nervously over her shoulder, "David's not here. He's playing golf." "I came to see you," Laura replied. "Can we talk?" They sat in Stephanie's pristine living room, Mason's carrier placed carefully on the coffee table between them, like a small bridge. Stephanie couldn't seem to stop looking at him, her hands twisting in her lap as she fought some internal battle. "I owe you an explanation," she said finally. "About Saturday. About everything." Laura waited, understanding instinctively that this conversation needed to happen at Stephanie's pace. "We've been trying for 3 years. 3 years of tests and procedures and disappointments. The doctors can't find anything specifically wrong, which somehow makes it worse. At least if there was a diagnosis, we'd have something to fight against." She looked up at Laura then, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "When you got pregnant so easily, so unexpectedly, it felt like the universe was laughing at us. Here we were doing everything right, planning and preparing and trying so hard, and it just happened for you." Laura felt a familiar stab of guilt, the same feeling that had plagued her throughout her pregnancy, whenever she encountered couples struggling with infertility. But this time, instead of apologizing for her situation, she found herself responding differently. "I understand why it felt unfair, but Stephanie, that wasn't my fault, and it's definitely not Mason's fault." "I know that," she said quickly. "Logically, I know that, but emotions aren't logical, are they? Every time I see him, I'm reminded of what I can't have, what I might never have." Mason chose that moment to wake up from his nap, his eyes opening slowly as he looked around the unfamiliar room. When his gaze landed on Stephanie, he studied her with the serious concentration he reserved for new faces, then broke into one of his irresistible smiles. Stephanie's breath caught. "He's beautiful," she whispered. "He really is beautiful." "Would you like to hold him?" Laura asked, surprising herself with the offer. For a moment, Stephanie was terrified. Then she nodded, reaching out with trembling hands as Laura placed Mason in her arms. The baby settled against her immediately, seeming to sense her need for gentleness. "I've been so angry," Stephanie admitted, tears finally spilling over. "At you, at David, at God, at myself, but mostly at the unfairness of it all. David thought if we just avoided seeing Mason, it would hurt less. But it doesn't hurt less. It just makes me feel guilty on top of everything else."
Laura watched her sister-in-law cradle her son, seeing the maternal instincts that had nowhere to go, the love that had been waiting for a child who might never come. "David doesn't know I'm telling you this," Stephanie continued, "but I've been thinking about divorce." The admission hung in the air between them like a bomb that had been quietly ticking.
Laura felt her world shift slightly as she processed this information. Not because of the fertility issues, Stephanie rushed to explain, because of how he's handled them, how he's tried to control my emotions instead of dealing with his own, how he thought excluding your baby would somehow fix our problems. They talked for 2 hours, with Mason contentedly moving between them as if he sensed the importance of bringing these two women together. Stephanie shared details about her fertility struggles that she'd never told anyone except David. The monthly cycles of hope and disappointment, the way other people's pregnancy announcements felt like personal attacks, the growing distance in her marriage as the pressure mounted. Laura found herself opening up in return, talking about the loneliness of single motherhood, the fear that she was failing Mason by not being able to give him a traditional family, the way David's rejection had awakened insecurities she didn't even know she had. "I want you to know," Stephanie said as Laura prepared to leave, "that what David said at the party about poor choices and consequences, that wasn't from me. I think you're incredibly brave for doing this on your own. And I want you to know that I would never intentionally flaunt my happiness to hurt you. If there's ever a way I can support you through this, even if it's just listening, I'm here." The drive home felt different than the drive there. Laura had expected to confront an enemy and instead had reconnected with a friend. But she'd also learned that her family's problems went deeper than she'd realized. David wasn't just being cruel for cruelty's sake. He was lashing out from his own pain and frustration, using Laura and Mason as scapegoats for problems he couldn't solve. That revelation didn't excuse his behavior, but it gave Laura a new perspective on the conflict. This wasn't just about acceptance or family loyalty anymore. This was about people in pain making bad choices about how to handle that pain. Monday morning brought a call from Jennifer Walsh, her boss at Morrison Associates. "Laura, I need to talk with you about something," Jennifer said, her usually warm voice sounding formal and careful. "Could you come to my office when you have a moment?" Laura's stomach dropped. She'd been performing well since returning from maternity leave, hadn't missed any important deadlines, and even had picked up extra projects, but the formal tone in Jennifer's voice suggested this wasn't about work performance. "I received a call on Friday," Jennifer began, once Laura was seated across from her desk, "from someone claiming to be your brother. He expressed some concerns about your personal situation affecting your professional judgment." Laura felt the blood drain from her face. What kind of concerns? "He suggested that single motherhood was making you unstable, that you'd been making poor decisions that could reflect badly on the company." Jennifer's expression was carefully neutral. "He also mentioned something about family conflicts that might require legal intervention." The betrayal hit Laura like a physical blow. It was one thing for David to attack her at family gatherings, but involving her career crossed a line she hadn't even known existed. "None of that is true," Laura said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "My personal life has never interfered with my work performance." "I know that," Jennifer replied, her tone warming slightly. "Your work has been exemplary, especially considering the challenges of new motherhood. But I wanted you to know about the call, and I wanted to ask, is there anything I should be aware of? Any situation that might affect your work?" Laura made a decision in that moment that surprised her with its clarity. Instead of minimizing the situation or making excuses, she told Jennifer the truth about David's attempts to exclude Mason from family events, about the birthday party confrontation, and about the way her brother was now trying to undermine her professional life. When she finished, Jennifer was quiet for a long moment. Then she leaned forward, her expression serious but supportive. "Laura, I want you to document everything. Every call, every message, every attempt to interfere with your work or your reputation. What your brother is doing could constitute harassment, and it's definitely unethical." "I don't want to make this a bigger deal than it has to be," Laura began. "It's already a big deal," Jennifer interrupted. "He brought it into your workplace. He tried to damage your professional reputation. That's not family conflict anymore. That's sabotage." As Laura walked back to her desk, she realized that her commitment to standing up for herself and Mason was going to require more than just showing up to family parties. It was going to require protecting herself against attacks she hadn't even anticipated, building defenses she'd never thought she'd need. But she was learning that she was stronger than she'd ever imagined, and that strength was growing with each challenge she faced.
The scared young woman who'd received David's cruel text message was evolving into someone who wouldn't be intimidated or silenced. The real test of that strength was coming sooner than she knew. 2 weeks after David's call to her workplace, Laura thought the worst was behind her. She'd documented everything as Jennifer suggested, had even consulted with a lawyer friend of Carmen's about potential harassment claims. Mason was thriving at daycare, her work performance remained strong, and she'd started to believe that standing up to David had been the right choice. She was wrong. The crisis began on a Tuesday morning in late April, when Laura arrived at Little Sprouts Daycare to find Mrs. Chen waiting for her in the parking lot, her usually cheerful face grave with concern. "Laura, we need to talk," Mrs. Chen said before Laura had even unbuckled Mason from his car seat. "There's been a situation." They sat in Mrs. Chen's small office while Mason played contentedly in his portable playpen, completely unaware of the tension crackling around him. Mrs. Chen pulled out a manila folder and placed it on the desk between them with obvious reluctance. "Yesterday, I received a visit from Child Protective Services," she began, her accented English careful and precise. "Someone filed a report claiming that Mason was being neglected, that you were an unfit mother." Laura felt the world tilt sideways. "That's impossible. Mason is perfectly healthy, happy." "I know that," Mrs. Chen interrupted gently. "Anyone who spends 5 minutes with that baby can see he's well cared for and loved. But CPS is required to investigate all reports, no matter how obviously false they might be." The social worker, a tired-looking woman named Patricia Holloway, had spent an hour at the daycare on Monday, interviewing staff members and observing Mason during playtime. She'd taken photographs of his physical condition, reviewed his feeding and nap schedule, and asked detailed questions about Laura's behavior during drop-offs and pickups. "What did they find?" Laura asked, though she already knew. Mason was clearly thriving. He'd gained weight appropriately, hit all his developmental milestones, and was generally considered one of the happiest babies at the center. "Nothing concerning at all," Mrs. Chen confirmed. "But Laura, there's more. The person who filed the report provided very specific details about your living situation, your work schedule, even your family dynamics. This wasn't a random complaint. Someone who knows you very well made these accusations." She didn't need to ask who. The specificity of the allegations, the timing coming so soon after David's workplace interference, it all pointed to her brother's escalating campaign against her. "What happens now?" Laura asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded when everything inside her was screaming. "Miss Holloway wants to do a home visit this Friday," she replied. "She'll inspect your apartment, interview you formally, and observe you caring for Mason. She assured me it's routine in cases like this, but..." "But what?" She hesitated, then leaned forward with the expression of someone about to share unwelcome news. "The complaint alleged that you're suffering from postpartum depression, that you've been erratic and unstable, and that Mason might be better off in foster care or with other family members." The words hit Laura like physical blows. Foster care. Other family members. The implication was clear. David wasn't just trying to exclude Mason from family events anymore. He was trying to take him away entirely. Laura left the daycare in a daze, calling in sick to work and driving aimlessly around Seattle while Mason slept in his car seat. She found herself at Discovery Park, sitting on a bench overlooking Puget Sound while ferry boats moved like toys across the gray water. How had it come to this? 6 months ago, she had been planning a quiet life as a single mother, focused on providing for her son and building a stable future. Now she was facing a CPS investigation that could result in losing Mason entirely. The magnitude of David's cruelty was breathtaking, using the system designed to protect children as a weapon against his own nephew. Her phone buzzed with a text from Carmen. "Heard about CPS from Rosa. Flying up tonight. Don't make any decisions until I get there." That evening, Carmen arrived at Laura's apartment like a whirlwind, carrying 2 suitcases and a determination that filled the small space. She took one look at Laura's tear-stained face and immediately took charge. First things first, Carmen announced, pulling cleaning supplies from under Laura's kitchen sink. We're going to make this place absolutely spotless. Then we're going to organize every document you have that proves you're a good mother. Then we're going to call that lawyer friend of mine and get some real legal advice. They worked until midnight, scrubbing surfaces that were already clean, organizing baby supplies that were already organized, and creating a paper trail that documented every aspect of Mason's care. Carmen had brought her laptop and began creating a presentation that would demonstrate Laura's fitness as a mother, complete with photos, medical records, and testimonials from daycare staff. "This is insane," Laura said, sitting on her living room floor, surrounded by manila folders and baby books. "I shouldn't have to prove that I love my own son." "You're right, it is insane. But insane people do insane things, and David has apparently lost his damn mind, so we're going to beat him at his own game." The lawyer, Sarah Kim, met with them Wednesday evening and was both reassuring and sobering. The good news was that CPS investigations were thorough but fair. If Laura truly was providing good care for Mason, that would become obvious quickly. The bad news was that the process could take weeks or even months, during which Laura would be under intense scrutiny. The most concerning thing, Sarah explained, is the allegation about postpartum depression. Even if you are experiencing some depression, which would be completely normal and treatable, the complaint seems to be designed to paint you as dangerously unstable. "I'm not dangerously unstable," Laura protested. "I'm stressed because my brother is trying to destroy my life, but I'm not—" "I believe you," Sarah interrupted. "But you might want to consider getting a professional evaluation, just to have documentation on your side. It's hard to argue with a licensed therapist's assessment."
Thursday passed in a blur of preparation and anxiety. Laura took another sick day, something that would normally have stressed her, but seemed insignificant compared to the possibility of losing her son. She and Carmen continued organizing, practiced responses to potential questions, and tried to anticipate every possible criticism of Laura's parenting or living situation. That evening, as they sat exhausted on Laura's couch with Mason playing between them, Laura finally broke down completely. "What if they take him?" she sobbed. "What if David convinces them that I'm not good enough? What if Mason ends up in foster care because I was too proud to just stay away from family events?" Carmen pulled her sister close, letting her cry against her shoulder the way she had when they were children. "That's not going to happen," Carmen said fiercely. "We won't let it happen. And Laura, this isn't your fault. You didn't cause this by standing up for yourself. David caused this by being a vindictive asshole who can't handle not getting his way." But even Carmen's fierce loyalty couldn't quiet the voice in Laura's head that whispered, maybe David was right. Maybe she had been selfish to disrupt family harmony. Maybe Mason would be better off with a traditional family, with 2 parents and financial stability and relatives who didn't see him as a problem to be solved. Friday morning arrived gray and rainy, matching Laura's mood perfectly. She'd barely slept, had spent most of the night second-guessing every parenting decision she'd ever made. When Mason woke up cranky from her restless energy, Laura felt like it was an omen of disaster to come. Patricia Holloway arrived precisely at 10 a.m., a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, but a professional demeanor that revealed nothing about her intentions. She spent 2 hours in Laura's apartment, checking the refrigerator contents, examining the baby-proofing measures, observing Laura feed and change Mason. "He's clearly attached to you," Miss Holloway noted, watching Mason reach for Laura whenever she moved out of his sight. "That's always a good sign." The interview portion was more challenging. Ms. Holloway asked detailed questions about Laura's support system, her financial situation, her mental health, her plans for Mason's future. Some questions felt invasive. Had she ever used drugs or alcohol? Had she ever felt like hurting Mason? Did she have any history of mental illness? "I understand someone close to you filed this report," Ms. Holloway said toward the end of the visit. "Family conflicts can be very stressful, especially for new mothers. How are you coping with that stress?" Laura chose her words carefully. My brother and I are having a disagreement about family boundaries. It's been difficult, but it hasn't affected my ability to care for Mason. If anything, it's made me more protective of him. Miss Holloway made notes without revealing her thoughts. I'll be interviewing other family members as part of this investigation. Is there anyone you'd particularly like me to speak with? Laura provided contact information for Carmen, her parents, Aunt Rosa, and Uncle Miguel. She also included Mrs. Chen from the daycare and Dr. Sarah Martinez, Mason's pediatrician. After Miss Holloway left, Laura collapsed on her couch feeling completely drained. Carmen made tea, and they sat in silence, both understanding that Laura's fate was now in someone else's hands. What if they take just the beginning? Laura asked quietly. What if David keeps escalating until he destroys everything I've built? It was a question neither of them could answer. For the first time since this conflict began, Laura felt truly powerless, at the mercy of systems and people who didn't know her or Mason, but could make life-altering decisions about their future. The waiting began, and with it, the darkest period of Laura's life since Mason's birth. Every phone call could be the one that changed everything. Every knock on the door could be someone coming to take her son away. She'd fought to claim her place in her family, but now she faced the possibility of losing the most important family she'd ever created, the small, perfect unit of herself and Mason that had become her entire world.
The breakthrough came from an unexpected source on a Wednesday morning, exactly 1 week after Patricia Holloway's home visit. Laura was mechanically going through her morning routine, feeding Mason, getting ready for work, trying to pretend that everything was normal while her world hung in the balance, when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. "Is this Laura Martinez?" The voice was female, older, with a slight southern accent. "Yes, this is Laura." "My name is Helen Fitzgerald. I'm a social worker supervisor with King County CPS. I'm calling about your case, and I think we need to meet as soon as possible." Laura's blood turned to ice. A supervisor calling could only mean bad news. Her hands started shaking as she reached for a pen to write down the meeting details. "I can meet you this afternoon at 2 p.m., Helen continued. "But, Miss Martinez, I want you to bring your lawyer if you have one. And I think you should know, this case has taken some very unusual turns." The call ended, leaving Laura staring at her phone in terror. Carmen had returned to Portland the day before, confident that the investigation would clear Laura quickly. Now Laura faced the possibility of life-changing news completely alone. She called Sarah Kim, who rearranged her schedule to meet Laura at the CPS office. Then Laura called her boss, explaining that she had a family emergency and needed the afternoon off. Jennifer's voice was warm with concern, reminding Laura that she had the company's full support. At Little Sprouts, Mrs. Chen took one look at Laura's face and immediately offered to keep Mason for the afternoon, even though it wasn't a regular daycare day. "Whatever happens," Mrs. Chen said firmly, "that baby knows he is loved. Never forget that." The King County CPS office was a sterile building in downtown Seattle that felt more like a hospital than a place where family fates were decided. Laura sat in the waiting room with Sarah Kim, watching other families navigate their own crises. Teenage mothers with social workers, foster parents dropping off children for visits, lawyers huddled in intense conversations. Helen Fitzgerald was nothing like what Laura had expected. She was a tall, African-American woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of presence that suggested she'd seen everything and wasn't easily impressed. Her office was warm and lived in, filled with children's artwork and photos that spoke of decades devoted to family welfare. "Miss Martinez," Helen began, settling behind her desk with a thick folder. "I've been a social worker for 28 years, and I've never seen a case quite like this one." Laura gripped Sarah's hand under the table, preparing herself for the worst. "Let me start by saying that you have nothing to worry about regarding your son's welfare. Our investigation found absolutely no evidence of neglect or abuse. In fact, Mason appears to be one of the most well-cared-for children I've encountered in recent memory." Laura's knees go weak with relief, but Helen wasn't finished.
However, the person who filed this report provided information that was so detailed and so specifically designed to trigger an investigation that it raised immediate red flags. When someone knows exactly which buzzwords to use, which allegations will prompt the most serious response, it suggests they've researched how to weaponize our system. Helen opened the folder and pulled out several documents. We interviewed your family members as part of our standard procedure. Your parents, your aunt and uncle, your sister, all provided glowing testimonials about your parenting. But when we contacted your brother David... She paused, looking directly at Laura with an expression that was both professional and deeply troubled. Your brother refused to be interviewed. Instead, he demanded to know why we weren't immediately removing Mason from your care. He became agitated when we explained that we found no evidence of problems, and he began making additional allegations that were, frankly, bizarre. Sarah leaned forward. What kind of additional allegations? He claimed that Laura was part of some kind of conspiracy to deceive us, that we weren't doing our jobs properly, and that he had evidence of her instability that we were ignoring. Helen's tone hardened. When we asked to see this evidence, he became verbally abusive toward our staff and demanded to speak to our supervisor. Laura stared at Helen in shock. He contacted your supervisor? He did. Multiple times. He called our main office 6 times in 3 days, each time becoming more agitated and making increasingly outlandish claims. Helen pulled out another document. This is where the case took an interesting turn. Your brother's behavior was so concerning that we began to wonder if the original report was made in bad faith. The revelation hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded. Laura had spent a week terrified that CPS would find her wanting, never imagining that David's own behavior would undermine his accusations. We don't typically investigate the motivations behind reports, Helen continued, but when someone's conduct suggests they may be misusing our system for personal vendettas, we take that very seriously. Making false reports to CPS is a felony, Miss Martinez. Sarah spoke up. Are you saying you believe the report was deliberately false? I'm saying that the evidence strongly suggests someone wanted to cause maximum disruption to Miss Martinez's life, regardless of the impact on the child involved. Using child welfare services as a weapon in family disputes is one of the most despicable things I encounter in this job.
Laura found her voice. What happens now? Now, we close your case with a finding of unfounded, meaning the allegations were investigated and determined to be without merit. More importantly, we're referring David Martinez's conduct to our fraud investigation unit. If they determine he knowingly filed a false report, he could face criminal charges. The meeting continued for another hour, with Helen explaining the documentation that would be in Laura's file and the resources available if David attempted any further harassment. But Laura barely heard the details. She was processing the stunning reversal. Not only was she cleared of any wrongdoing, but David's own behavior had turned the investigation against him. Walking out of the CPS building into the Seattle afternoon, Laura felt like she was seeing the world with new eyes. The fear that had consumed her for weeks was gone, replaced by something she hadn't expected: clarity. I need to go see someone, she told Sarah as they stood on the sidewalk outside the building. An hour later, Laura was sitting in Stephanie's living room again. But this time, the dynamic was completely different. Word of David's escalating behavior had reached Stephanie through her own sources. Apparently, David had been ranting about the CPS investigation to anyone who would listen, painting himself as a victim of a corrupt system. He's lost his mind, Stephanie said, her face pale and drawn. Laura, I had no idea he would do something like this. Using CPS, trying to have Mason taken away, that's not the man I married. She had been staying at her mother's house for the past week, she revealed. David's obsession with destroying Laura had consumed him completely, turning their home into a place of constant anger and paranoia.
He keeps saying that if he can just prove you're unfit, if he can just get Mason placed with appropriate family members, then everything will go back to normal, Stephanie continued. But Laura, I don't think anything will ever be normal again. I think this has broken something in him that can't be fixed. As they talked, Laura began to understand something she'd missed before. David's campaign against her wasn't really about Mason, or family dynamics, or even Stephanie's fertility struggles. It was about control. David had built his identity around being the successful one, the one who made the rules, the one whose approval everyone sought. Laura's independence, her refusal to be ashamed of her choices, threatened that carefully constructed hierarchy. I used to think he was protecting me, Stephanie admitted, but now I see that he was trying to protect his image of himself. And when that image was threatened, he was willing to destroy anyone who challenged it, even his own sister. That evening, Laura sat in her apartment with Mason on her lap, finally able to enjoy the simple pleasure of holding her son without fear. She called Carmen with the good news, then her parents, then Aunt Rosa. Each conversation brought the same response: relief, joy, and growing anger at David's actions. But Laura found that her own anger was evolving into something else. She wasn't just angry at David anymore. She was disappointed. Disappointed that the brother she'd looked up to her entire life had revealed himself to be capable of such cruelty. Disappointed that their family would never be the same. Disappointed that Mason would grow up knowing his uncle had tried to have him taken away. But underneath the disappointment was a new kind of strength. Laura had survived the worst thing she could imagine, the threat of losing her child, and she'd emerged with her integrity intact. She'd learned that she had more allies than she'd known, more inner resources than she'd believed, and more worth than she'd ever given herself credit for. The next morning, Laura made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a month earlier. She called David directly. I know about the CPS investigation being closed. I know about the fraud investigation. And I know about Stephanie staying at her mother's house. There was silence on the other end of the line. I'm not calling to gloat. I'm calling to tell you that this ends now. Your campaign against Mason and me stops today. If you ever try to interfere in our lives again, through CPS, through my workplace, through any other avenue, I will pursue every legal remedy available to me. You can't, David began. Yes, I can, Laura interrupted, her voice steady and strong. I've learned that I'm much stronger than you thought I was. I've learned that I have people who will fight for me, and I've learned that your opinion of my worth doesn't define my reality. She hung up before he could respond, then immediately called Sarah Kim to discuss getting a restraining order. For the first time since this nightmare began, Laura felt like she was the one in control. She had stopped reacting to David's attacks and started taking proactive steps to protect herself and Mason. The scared young woman who'd received that first cruel text message was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own power. The real victory wasn't just surviving David's worst assault. It was discovering that she'd been strong enough all along to defend the life she'd built. She just hadn't known it yet.
3 weeks after Laura's confrontation with David, she thought the storm had finally passed. The restraining order had been granted without opposition. David hadn't even appeared in court to contest it. Stephanie had filed for divorce and was staying permanently with her mother. The family had seemingly accepted the new reality of David's exile from their lives. Laura had begun to relax back into her routine of work, daycare pickups, and quiet evenings with Mason. She'd even started dating again, tentatively accepting coffee invitations from Marcus, a pediatric nurse she'd met at Mason's 6-month checkup. Life felt like it was moving forward rather than just surviving crisis after crisis. But David wasn't finished. The final challenge arrived on a Friday afternoon in early June, delivered not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a certified letter waiting for Laura when she arrived home from work.
Mason was babbling happily in his carrier, reaching for the colorful flowers in the neighbor's garden, completely unaware that another storm was about to hit their small family. Laura's hands trembled as she opened the legal envelope, reading the heading, Petition for Custody and Visitation Rights, David Martinez versus Laura Martinez. The document was 12 pages of legal language that essentially argued that David, as Mason's uncle and the only stable male figure in his life, deserved court-ordered visitation rights. The petition claimed that Laura had alienated Mason from his paternal family, that she was demonstrably unstable based on the CPS investigation, and that Mason's best interests required maintaining relationships with his extended family. What made the petition truly breathtaking in its audacity was the final page. David was requesting emergency temporary custody of Mason pending a full hearing, claiming that Laura posed an immediate threat to the child's welfare. Laura sank into her kitchen chair, the legal papers scattered across the table, and felt something she hadn't experienced since the darkest days of the CPS investigation: genuine terror. Not the manageable anxiety of dealing with family conflict, but bone-deep fear that the legal system might somehow be manipulated to separate her from her son. She called Sarah Kim immediately, reading the petition aloud over the phone, while Mason played at her feet, oblivious to the latest threat to their small family. Sarah said, after hearing the details, "This is frivolous. Uncles don't have automatic custody rights, especially when there's documented evidence of harassment. But Laura, I need you to understand something. David has hired a very expensive law firm. This isn't going away quietly." The law firm was Patterson, Klein & Associates, known for their aggressive tactics in high-stakes family law cases. They'd taken David's case on contingency, which meant they believed they could win significant damages or custody arrangements. The petition was professionally crafted to make David seem like a concerned family member fighting for a child's welfare, rather than what he actually was, a man using the legal system to continue his harassment campaign. Laura spent the weekend in a state of controlled panic, researching everything she could about custody law and preparing for what Sarah warned would be an intensive legal battle. Carmen flew up from Portland again, this time bringing her boyfriend Jake, a paralegal who helped them organize documents and understand the legal strategies David's team might employ. "The emergency custody request is just intimidation," Jake explained, reviewing the petition with his professional eye. "No judge is going to remove a baby from a loving mother based on these allegations, especially with your CPS investigation results. But the longer case, that's where it gets complicated." The emergency hearing was scheduled for the following Wednesday, giving Laura only 4 days to prepare. Sarah explained that they needed to demonstrate not just that Laura was a good mother, but that David's request was motivated by spite rather than genuine concern for Mason's welfare. "We need witnesses," Sarah said during their strategy session Monday evening. "People who can testify about your relationship with Mason, about David's behavior, about the pattern of harassment." Laura created a list that surprised her with its length. Mrs. Chen from the daycare, Dr. Martinez the pediatrician, Jennifer Walsh from work, her parents, Carmen, Aunt Rosa, and Uncle Miguel, even Marcus, the nurse who'd seen her interact with Mason during medical appointments. When she actually counted them, Laura realized she had an entire community of people who could vouch for her fitness as a mother. But David's team had been busy too. Through pre-hearing discovery, Laura learned that they'd interviewed Jake Thompson, Mason's biological father, trying to convince him to support their custody petition. They'd contacted her former neighbors from her previous apartment, looking for anyone who might testify to instability or neglect. They'd even reached out to her college professors, searching for any evidence of past mental health issues or academic problems. The fact that they'd found nothing useful didn't stop them from creating an impressive-looking case file designed to make Laura seem like a defendant rather than a protective mother. Tuesday night, Laura barely slept. She'd arranged for the day off work, confirmed that all her witnesses would be present, and reviewed her testimony with Sarah until she could recite it perfectly. But lying in her bed, listening to Mason's peaceful breathing from his crib nearby, Laura felt the full weight of what she was facing. Tomorrow, she would have to stand in a courtroom and defend her right to raise her own child. She would have to prove to strangers that she was worthy of being Mason's mother. The absurdity of it was overwhelming, but so was the very real possibility that a judge might be swayed by David's expensive lawyers and professional presentation. Tuesday morning dawned clear and bright, one of those perfect Seattle summer days that made the city feel like paradise. Laura dressed carefully in her most professional outfit, a navy blue suit she'd bought for job interviews, paired with the pearl earrings her grandmother had left her for luck. The courthouse was intimidating, all marble and formal procedures that made Laura feel small and out of place. David was already there when she arrived, flanked by 2 lawyers in expensive suits, and looking more confident than she'd seen him since this whole conflict began. He'd lost weight and gained a hardness around his eyes that made him seem like a stranger.
The hearing was held in a small courtroom before Judge Elizabeth Warren, a middle-aged woman with gray hair and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she'd heard every possible family dispute. Laura sat at a table with Sarah, trying to project calm while her heart hammered against her ribs. David's lead attorney, a polished man named Richard Patterson, presented their case with theatrical flair. He painted Laura as an isolated single mother who'd alienated her son from his extended family, describing David as a successful businessman trying to maintain important family connections despite Laura's increasingly erratic behavior. "Your Honor," Patterson said, gesturing toward David with obvious respect, "my client simply wants to ensure that his nephew has access to the stable, traditional family structure that every child deserves." Mrs. Martinez's pattern of conflict and confrontation suggests that she may not be capable of making decisions that prioritize her son's best interests. It was a masterful performance, Laura had to admit. Patterson made David sound reasonable and concerned while making her sound vindictive and unstable. If she hadn't lived through the reality of David's harassment campaign, she might have been convinced by the presentation herself. But when Sarah stood to present Laura's case, the tone in the courtroom shifted dramatically. "Your Honor, this petition is not about a concerned uncle seeking visitation with his nephew. This is about a man who has spent months systematically harassing and intimidating his sister because she refused to be ashamed of her son's existence." Sarah methodically laid out the timeline of David's behavior: the initial text message excluding Mason from family events, the workplace harassment, the false CPS report, the escalating pattern of interference in Laura's life. She presented documentation of everything from the recorded calls to David's workplace to the CPS investigation results to the restraining order. Then came the witnesses. Mrs. Chen testified about Mason's obvious attachment to Laura and the quality of care he received. Dr. Martinez spoke about Mason's excellent health and development, emphasizing that children who are neglected or abused typically show physical and emotional signs that were completely absent in Mason's case. Jennifer Walsh testified about Laura's professionalism at work and the harassment calls David had made to her workplace. Carmen spoke passionately about Laura's transformation into motherhood and the strength she'd shown throughout David's campaign against her. But it was Laura's parents who delivered the most devastating testimony. Roberto Martinez took the stand looking older than his 65 years, his weathered hands shaking slightly as he was sworn in. When Sarah asked him to describe David's behavior at the birthday party, Roberto's voice was heavy with disappointment. "I raised my son to protect his family, not to attack it. What David has done to his sister and nephew, it's not the behavior of a man who cares about children. It's the behavior of a man who can't accept that he doesn't control everyone around him." Maria's testimony was even more powerful. Laura's mother had always been diplomatic, always trying to keep peace in the family. But on the witness stand, Maria's voice was clear and strong.
My daughter, Laura, has been taking care of this family her whole life. When my husband was sick, Laura coordinated his care. When we needed help with anything, Laura was there. She's been the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who puts family first, always. Maria paused, glancing at David before continuing. My son, David, is trying to take away her baby because he couldn't control her decisions. That's not love. That's not family. That's cruelty. When it was David's turn to testify, his practiced composure began to crack under Sarah's cross-examination. Asked to provide specific examples of Laura's unfitness as a mother, he could only cite her defiance of family wishes and her disruptive behavior at family events. So your concern, Sarah pressed, is that Ms. Martinez attended your mother's birthday party against your wishes? She brought the baby when I specifically told her not to, David replied, his voice rising. She showed a complete disregard for family harmony and my wife's feelings. And your solution was to call Child Protective Services and attempt to have the baby removed from his mother's care. I was trying to protect. Were you protecting the baby, Mr. Martinez, or were you punishing your sister for not obeying your instructions? David's face flushed red. Laura has always been irresponsible. This baby is just another example of her poor judgment, and someone needs to make sure he has proper guidance. It was exactly the wrong thing to say. Laura watched Judge Warren's expression harden as David exposed himself as petty and vindictive under pressure. The hearing lasted 4 hours. When Judge Warren finally called for a recess to review the evidence, Laura felt simultaneously exhausted and exhilarated. She'd told her story completely and honestly, and she'd watched David expose himself as petty and vindictive under pressure. But the real test would come when Judge Warren returned with her decision. Everything Laura had built with Mason hung in the balance, waiting for a stranger to decide if they belonged together.
Judge Warren returned to the courtroom after what felt like an eternity, but was actually only 45 minutes. Laura sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, watching the judge's face for any hint of the decision that would reshape her entire future. Beside her, Sarah maintained her professional composure, but Laura could see the tension in her attorney's shoulders. David sat across the aisle with his expensive legal team, his confidence from earlier in the day now replaced by something that looked suspiciously like nervousness. The theatrical presentation that had seemed so polished that morning now felt hollow in the aftermath of the devastating testimony from Laura's family and community. I've reviewed all the evidence presented today, Judge Warren began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd made countless difficult decisions about families in crisis. I've considered the testimony of all witnesses, the documentation provided by both parties, and the relevant case law regarding custody and visitation rights. Laura held her breath, feeling as though her entire world was balanced on the edge of whatever words came next. Mr. Martinez, Judge Warren continued, looking directly at David, your petition fundamentally misunderstands the nature of family relationships and the legal standards for custody modifications. Uncles do not have inherent rights to custody or court-ordered visitation with their nephews or nieces, particularly when there is clear evidence that such contact would not serve the child's best interests. Laura felt her knees go weak with relief. But Judge Warren wasn't finished. More concerning to this court is the pattern of behavior demonstrated by the petitioner. The evidence shows a systematic campaign of harassment designed to punish Ms. Martinez for decisions that were entirely within her rights as a parent. The false report to Child Protective Services was particularly troubling, as it represents a dangerous misuse of systems designed to protect children. David's face had gone pale, his expensive lawyers suddenly very interested in their legal pads. This court finds no evidence whatsoever that Ms. Martinez is anything other than a devoted, capable mother. The testimony presented today painted a clear picture of a young woman who has built a stable, loving home for her child, despite facing extraordinary challenges
and harassment from her own family. The judge's gaze moved to Laura, and for the first time, her stern expression softened slightly. Ms. Martinez, your son is fortunate to have a mother who is willing to fight so fiercely for his welfare and dignity. The court is impressed by the community of support you've built around yourself and your child, and by your restraint in the face of provocation that would have broken many people. The judge picked up her gavel, and Laura felt time slow to a crawl. The petition for custody and visitation is denied in its entirety. Furthermore, this court is issuing a permanent restraining order prohibiting Mr. David Martinez from any contact with Ms. Martinez or her minor child, and from any interference in their lives through third parties or legal proxies. The gavel came down with a sound that seemed to echo through Laura's entire being. It was over. Not just the hearing, but the entire nightmare that had consumed her life for months. David's campaign of terror had not only failed, it had backfired so completely that he now faced legal consequences for his actions. As the courtroom began to empty, Laura felt Sarah's hand on her shoulder, grounding her in the reality of what had just happened. She'd won. More than that, she'd been vindicated completely, her worthiness as a mother confirmed by the highest authority she could imagine. David and his legal team left quickly, avoiding eye contact with Laura and her supporters. As they walked past, Laura caught a glimpse of her brother's face, not angry now, but hollow, as if something fundamental had broken inside him. For a moment, she felt an unexpected pang of sadness for the brother she had once admired, the man who'd been lost somewhere in his need to control everything around him. Outside the courthouse, Laura was surrounded by her family and friends, all talking at once, celebrating and offering congratulations. But the moment that would stay with her forever came when her father pulled her aside, his weathered face serious. "Mija," Roberto said quietly, using the childhood nickname he rarely employed anymore, "I owe you an apology. For too many years, I let David's success make me think he knew better than everyone else. I should have seen what he was becoming. I should have protected you from him sooner." Laura felt tears spring to her eyes, not of sadness, but of a healing she hadn't known she needed. "Dad, you stood up for me when it mattered most. That's what I'll remember." The weeks that followed brought a sense of peace Laura hadn't experienced since before Mason's birth. The restraining order meant that David couldn't contact her directly or through others, couldn't interfere in her work, or couldn't involve himself in any aspect of her life. For the first time in months, Laura felt truly safe. But more than safety, she'd gained something else, a deep understanding of her own strength and worth. The scared young woman who'd received that first cruel text message felt like a different person now, someone from a past life who'd been transformed by fire into something stronger and more resilient. Her relationship with her parents deepened in ways she hadn't expected. Without David's influence constantly pulling them in different directions, Maria and Roberto were free to express their pride in Laura and their adoration of Mason. Sunday dinners resumed, but now they felt different, more genuine, less performative, focused on celebration rather than maintaining appearances.
Carmen moved back to Seattle that summer, finding a job at a local gallery and an apartment just 15 minutes from Laura's place. Having her sister nearby felt like gaining a co-parent and best friend all at once. Carmen became Mason's favorite aunt, the one who spoiled him with art supplies and taught him to finger paint before he could properly walk. Stephanie's divorce was finalized in August, and to Laura's surprise, they maintained their friendship. Stephanie found a therapist who specialized in fertility issues and grief counseling, and began the difficult work of rebuilding her life without David's controlling influence. She and Laura met for coffee monthly, sometimes talking about their shared trauma, sometimes just enjoying each other's company without the weight of family politics between them. At work, Laura threw herself into projects with a confidence she'd never possessed before. Jennifer Walsh noticed the change immediately, promoting Laura to senior marketing coordinator and giving her leadership responsibilities she would have been too timid to accept a year earlier. Laura discovered she had natural leadership abilities that had been suppressed by years of trying to keep peace rather than making waves.
Her relationship with Marcus, the pediatric nurse, developed slowly but steadily. He'd witnessed some of the legal drama from the periphery and admired the grace with which Laura had handled impossible circumstances. Marcus was patient with her, her newfound caution about relationships, understanding that someone who'd been betrayed by family would need time to trust romantic partners. Most importantly, Mason thrived. By his first birthday in December, he was walking, babbling in what sounded like complete sentences, and charming everyone he met with his bright curiosity and easy laughter. He had no memory of the conflict that had surrounded his early months, no understanding that he'd once been unwanted by people who should have loved him unconditionally. Laura threw Mason's first birthday party at her parents' house, the same location where the conflict had begun at Maria's 70th birthday celebration. But this time, the atmosphere was pure joy. The living room was filled with balloons and decorations, the kitchen table groaned under the weight of a 3-tiered cake Carmen had commissioned from a local bakery, and every surface displayed photos of Mason's first year. As Laura watched her son destroy his piece of birthday cake with the single-minded enthusiasm only a 1-year-old could muster, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 12 months ago, she'd been a frightened new mother, desperate for approval and acceptance from people who saw her child as a problem to be managed. Now, she was surrounded by people who celebrated Mason's existence, who saw him as the gift he'd always been. The family she'd fought so hard to remain part of had revealed itself to be smaller, but infinitely more loving than she ever imagined. Later that evening, after the guests had gone home and Mason was sleeping peacefully in his crib, Laura sat in her living room looking through the photo album Carmen had made, documenting Mason's first year. There were pictures from the hospital the day he was born, shots of him at various family gatherings, images of his first smile, first solid food, first steps. But the photo that made Laura pause was one Carmen had taken at the courthouse the day of the custody hearing. Laura hadn't even realized her sister was taking pictures, but there it was. Laura standing on the courthouse steps, Mason in her arms, surrounded by everyone who'd come to support them. Her face in the photo showed exhaustion and stress, but also something else. An unshakable determination that had carried her through the darkest period of her life. Looking at that photo now, Laura could see the exact moment when she'd stopped being a victim and started being a warrior. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but the seeds had been planted the day she'd decided that no one else's comfort was more important than her son's right to belong. As she closed the photo album and prepared for bed, Laura's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Hope Mason's party was perfect. You've created something beautiful, not just today, but every day since he was born." Laura smiled, typing back, "We've created something beautiful, all of us together." And that was the truth she'd learned through months of conflict and growth. Family wasn't just about blood relations or traditional structures. Family was about the people who showed up when things got difficult, who celebrated your joys and supported you through challenges, who saw the best in you even when you couldn't see it yourself. Laura Martinez had fought for her place at the family table and discovered that the table she'd been fighting for wasn't worthy of the effort. But in the process, she'd built a new table, bigger, warmer, and filled with people who understood that love means making room for everyone, not deciding who deserves to belong. As she checked on Mason one final time before sleep, Laura whispered the same promise she'd made to him every night since the conflict began. "You are wanted. You are loved. You belong everywhere I belong, and I belong wherever love is." Outside her window, Seattle sparkled in the darkness, full of possibilities and new beginnings. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but Laura faced them now with the knowledge that she was strong enough to protect what mattered most. She'd learned to fight for love, and in the process, she'd discovered that she was worth fighting for too. The scared young woman who'd once begged for acceptance was gone, replaced by someone who knew her own value and would never again let anyone make her ashamed of the family she'd created.
It had taken a war to find peace, but the peace was real, and it was hers, and it was worth every battle she'd fought to claim it.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.